Herle Burly-ites. When a government is in crisis, who do you want to hear from? Political scientists and profs? Journalists? Herle? No. You want to hear from the people who have run governments, and we have them here. Our last pre-Christmas pod, and there may or may not be good cheer, we don't know. I've got my usual group of chiefs, people who were the chief of staff to a head of government and had to manage both politics and government. Ian Brodie, now at the University of Calgary, did that for Stephen Harper. Tim Murphy, now at AECON, did that for Paul Martin. And Brian Topp at GT&co did it for Roy Romanow and Rachel Notley. We're going to talk about a government in multiple crises. An imminent election that looks devastating, a controversy about whether the Prime Minister should stay, the resignation of the Minister of Finance, and a massive economic threat from our most important economic partner. There's also a significant cabinet shuffle today. Ooh, boy. All right, let's get to it. Tim, easy question. How would you characterize the situation the government finds itself in?
Oh, I think it's pretty clearly a crisis of leadership, a crisis of confidence, a crisis of direction, and an underlying crisis of, what's happening vis-a-vis our southern neighbor. So I think it's an accumulation of crises, some of which can be solved by political action or leadership, and others can't be. And so I think it's, the government's in a very challenging, to say the least, place. And the problem is a lot of the paths to fixing it go through one person who so far isn't showing his hand as to what the plan is.
Right. Ian, your experience, you've seen similar things?
Happily, no, I have never. No, we didn't have this kind of problems. Although I have to say, I've been around for the collapse of political parties and caucus infighting and so forth. So that's, I guess, that's not new. Look, I mean, the difficulty here is that there are really terrible choices and then really extremely painful choices, and I don't see anything that's any better than that. I mean, we can get into the different scenarios here, but even today's cabinet shuffle coming after we tape, I guess, how do you put together a cabinet shuffle when you don't, the Prime Minister has on the front page of the Globe and Mail today, I'm not sure whether I'm staying or going. How does he persuade people to come join the team with a role that might last more than 48 hours, 72 hours, if he decides to take a walk? A number of these people are presumably getting ready to launch their own leadership campaigns if he goes. So do you shuffle your cabinet and then have to let go of one of these ministers or half a dozen of these ministers when they go off to run for leadership? And those are just the problems between now and Christmas Eve. The situation does not get any better in the new year. We can look ahead to the transition in the United States. So I don't like any of the options here. There are no shortcuts. Obviously, everybody around the Prime Minister must be kicking themselves that they didn't make some of these decisions last summer or a year ago last summer. We can go back and pick the day that somebody left, some friend of the Prime Minister's left cabinet and started the crisis. But in a sense, since we emerged from COVID, there has been a kind of a drift in this government. The Prime Minister's deal with Mr. Singh sort of took him off the hook of having to think critically about the government's political future. I think we're now paying the price for that, and we're paying the price for that with an international and domestic situation that is much, much worse than it was back then.
Brian,
Merry Christmas, David.
Exactly. Brian, the Trudeau people have modeled so much of what they've done after the Obama people, but they didn't pick up on the no drama part of it.
Yeah. Well, they're right. At least this week. Look, here's my take on all this. But I got to work with Chrystia Freeland on the NAFTA negotiation, the CUSMA negotiation. I was on her advisory committee, which was a lot of fun, fascinating to see. And she was great in that role, like a really strong minister, really on top of the file, very strategic and canny and amazing at relationships. And we also saw that at work when, in effect, she appeared to be, running the national COVID response. And you saw, Doug Ford saying, I just can't help myself. I just like her, because she did a really great job at FedProv and at working closely with the premiers. And, those were the two big things that this government addressed the crisis of the first Trump administration and then the COVID thing. So when you're a minister who has played such a central and very effective role, and your government is down 20 on the eve of an election, it shouldn't be too surprising to you that the prime minister thinks about making a change because you're down 20 and something has to change or you're going to get annihilated in an election. And so I have to say, I don't think it was that surprising that the prime minister wanted to renew his team, wanted to bring in some new blood, wanted to change things around, because what has happened, they're heading toward that fatal 10-year mark of this government, and the public is sick of them, and they have to do something big to change that. And that's what the prime minister tried to do here, but it spun out of control catastrophically. The second thing I have to say is that the policy dispute that Ms. Freeland is picking with the prime minister in her resignation letter was the price of getting supply in the House this fall. Yeah. What she's taking objection to is the deals that the government cut with His Majesty's Fourth Party to have the government remain in office past October. And so I'm less impressed than some have been by the policy case that she's making. But the last thing I'll say is this. Whoever emerges as the prime minister in this government in coming weeks, I think they would be very well advised to think very hard about what my colleagues on this panel were just alluding to, which is that our principal trade partner is about to declare a trade war on us and using national security arguments like they did with aluminum and steel in the first Trump administration to impose, economy-wrecking tariffs. And what does that call for? It calls for a huge and effective outreach into the United States, governors and senators and House and representatives and all other friends to try to avoid this. It calls for putting together a countervail strategy that's not just repeating what Trump is doing, but that is strategic and reaches into the home states of key senators and congressmen in Congress to try to make this hurt as hard as possible with minimizing the damage to the Canadian economy. And it involves maybe, since Trump is picking this fights with everybody the United States trades with, maybe it if it can't be resolved bilaterally, it means looking for some friends in the world. And that's a huge challenge. And that's what this government needs to put in front of Parliament in the new year. And if it puts that in front of Parliament in the new year, then when there's a vote, as I believe there will be very quickly, on whether or not the government should stay, then it's not about the Prime Minister's attempt to renew his cabinet, which is fundamentally a side issue. And it's the most important thing facing the country. And then if we have an election, it will be about the most important thing facing the country and not trivia and nonsense and an Ottawa bubble, tempest in a teapot stuff. And then we'll have an election on something really, really important instead of on this or on the leader of the official opposition's angry nursery rhymes, and we will have a serious election and maybe hopefully we'll have us back to getting a serious government.
All right. And I hear you, Brian, but I do want to talk about the grubby political stuff before we get to the existential economic crisis. I want to dwell a little bit. And Tim, just to pick up on what Brian was saying about Freeland, it feels like maybe people underestimated how political she is. Mm-hmm. Because if I look at what she did, she basically said, well, I could be sacrificed to advance the Prime Minister's ambitions, or I could use this as an opportunity to advance my own ambitions. And much to, I think, everybody's surprise, she chose the latter. Do you have any speculation as to what went on in the end of that relationship?
So it's, I do have some, and just enough knowledge to be dangerous. So, what's interesting to me is obviously, that as a couple of things. One is the story around this Zoom meeting they had on Friday. And so there are different versions of that, unsurprisingly. And I think the PMO's version is that it was actually the conclusion of a negotiation that had been going on for some time, and that it was a Zoom meeting because it was basically the formality at the end of a process. And so I come back to Brian's point, which I think the policy basis that she outlined in her letter is as something dressed up from a policy perspective to give more meat to the departure. I think fundamentally the departure at the end of the day was to say, there's only one path to my political success, and that is at this point to try and launch a leadership process and to effectively launch it by, forcing him out. It was me. I read that as soon as I read her letter, I went, this is the launch of her leadership campaign. She's trying to use it to navigate back towards some middle by putting up this notion of political gimmicks around, and back to a serious notion of government, to pick up Brian's point. And I thought it was actually, one of the most effective political things outside of the substantive achievements Brian identified I've seen her do. It was an extremely effective knife in the front. And
it's a great letter.
Yeah. And so now the challenge she faces, just to be the grubby political part, is, she was launching a leadership campaign without having invested as much time and effort in building the base of an actual leadership campaign, both in caucus and in the broader party. So she was more lone wolfing it at this point. I mean, obviously, there was a goodwill towards her as a result of this, as we saw at various Christmas parties of her being, swamped with selfie seekers. But there's there isn't, for those of us who've been in this kind of process before, if you're going to do this, it's way better to do it with a force of party behind you, which she does not have. And I think you're seeing kind of, is the prime minister buying
Tim
himself?
used to remind me many, many times back in the day, if you're going to swing at the king, don't miss.
Yes. And so, so the question, she's obviously wounded him as she wounded him fatally. I mean, the problem we've got is there's a different position, right? I mean, as to Brian's point, this is a government 20 points behind in the polls. I think they're, frankly, an election around a potential solution to a Trump economic attack on Canada, however that is structured, or a deal that is carved out to make that true, is actually the one sort of serious path that a Liberal party could bring to the polls to create the kind of single election thing we had around free trade in '88, et cetera. Whether that is capable of being done with, Justin Trudeau as leader is a different question.
Right. Hey, Ian, tell me how politics works. So on Sunday, if you'd asked 100 people who follow Canadian politics, almost all of them would have told you that Chrystia Freeland was no good at being the finance minister of Canada. On Monday morning, she resigns, and the whole country is going, oh my God, how can Trudeau survive this death blow from this person resigning from her position?
Yes. Yes. Look, I mean, I don't have any insight into what happened over the weekend, since my contacts in the Liberal Party are
on this call.
You two, and a friend of yours who will remain nameless. Yeah, look, I mean, she was gradually deteriorating her internal position by virtue of sticking on through a government that was losing, half a point a month in the polls, or a quarter of a point a month in the polls, or what, pick your polling number, but was slowly deteriorating, and a fiscal situation that was taking her, we assume, further and further away from the median voter in her coalition for a future leadership race. That is a really desperate situation to be in, and she took her opportunity to leave. I guess what I'm taking from Tim's comment is, and I think if this is what he's hinting at, I think he's right, is that she made her big move, and then Trudeau survived. And, there were a couple of, Housefather and a couple of others who haven't said some nice things about her, but the leadership race that's going on seems to me, you tell me who you get calls from. God knows people don't phone me for a Liberal leadership race unless they're really desperate for the additional vote. But 5-6 people, I don't know whether Christy Clark's really in or not, who knows? And it seems to me that
I think she's more in than most.
Yeah,
possibly. Yeah, I mean, that's what Twitter seems to indicate to me, or her Instagram feed seems to indicate to me. So this is not like you guys and Chrétien back in 2001, 2002, where there was one guy who had hoovered up the entire organizational base and all of the support of caucus and so on and so forth, and had himself as the primary internal challenger to Chrétien staying on. And as a result, we have 6 or 7 different internal agendas of different leadership candidates, some of whom might think this is their time to go, some of whom might think their time to go is next summer, some of whom want the implosion to come in the election and they want to be around for the rebuild. I mean, those people are insane, but somebody's out there thinking about that because the alternatives are too ugly for them. And as a result, this idea that you can have, as I heard this week, from Ottawa, that we can have, well, let's have a scenario like the Americans had, on the Democrat side, where we make a clean, quick swap. There is no such scenario because the power structure seems to be inside the Liberal Party. The balance of forces inside the Liberal Party will not allow that. And so the idea that there's going to be some kind of shortened leadership race where this all gets wrapped up before January 20th and we have a coronation of somebody, who's the person who would be crowned in the coronation scenario? God knows who. I don't think anybody knows. And certainly nobody's going to consent to somebody else being crowned here. So, this is in a sense may be an indication that Ms. Freeland didn't do her homework with the base, as Tim said. I think that's almost certainly true. But I think it's also a reflection of just who's holding which cards in which hand inside the Liberal Party. The situation is too diffuse for somebody to have made the single shot, because there's some people who may not want Mr. Trudeau to carry on for the next election, but don't want to have a leadership race until April or May. And they'll applaud her when she walks into a Laurier Club reception for having hurt the guy in charge, but they don't want to pull the plug right now.
Yeah, Brian. Maybe it'll happen at the cabinet shuffle, but as we record this, the Prime Minister has said nothing to Canadians about this crisis in his own government all week long. What are the considerations that would have gone into that? Because to be honest, I would have been advising somebody to be out there asserting their leadership right away.
Well, I think they were shocked that this all blew up. I think the fact that Mr. Carney was in fact not prepared to come in and replace her, even though based on what we can read in the Globe, that was the whole scenario. That what the Prime Minister told Ms. Freeland is that she was intending to replace her with him. And then he has gone back into his Hamlet role and appears to not be with us. And so I think the scenario that they were working on blew up in their face. And it would appear that what's happened is they've given themselves 2 or 3 days to just quietly do their homework and actually make the phone calls and look people in the eyes and say, so we're agreeing that you're going to do this and you're really going to do it, right? And I don't think it's too surprising that they basically needed to be in R&D for a couple of days because what they had been quietly working on for probably quite a while blew up in their face.
Some of you Herle Burly-ites know, only because I've mentioned it before on the show, I went to school to become a lawyer. LLB, University of Saskatchewan. Did I ever actually practice law? I did not. I give you this piece of my backstory because this latest installment from our presenting sponsor Telus revolves around the law and the courts, and there's jargon involved. Legal jargon I'm no longer hep to. Still, I'll do my best to put it in simple language. Telus is going to court, more precisely federal court. They are asking the court to quash the federal cabinet order to the CRTC. I've been outlining the story for weeks now. The cabinet order directs the CRTC to reconsider whether competitors like our presenting sponsor Telus are able to offer internet services in Ontario and Quebec. Telus is taking this action on behalf of Canadian consumers who deserve the benefits more competition brings in the marketplace. They're that serious about protecting consumer choice and affordability for Canadians. You don't need a law degree to see that. And whether you've been following all along or you're just hearing this for the first time, it's likely you have questions. Like, why is the federal cabinet putting themselves in the position of picking corporate winners and losers when more competition, no matter where that competition comes from, provides more value to consumers? Why restrict access to new innovative product bundles that can deliver more affordable solutions overall? And why not give people the right to choose their own internet provider? Telus has those same questions, and they're fighting to get answers. I'll just finish this up by saying this is an issue people, not shockingly, care about. There are over 25,000 signatures on the change.org petition. That figure grows in number and purpose every day. Please add your name at demandmoreinternetchoice.ca.
If I could just track back to Freeland for 1 second. She's in an interesting spot here. If you look at what has happened to the British Labour Party in public opinion polls in the UK, it's fascinating to look at what's happened to them. So they although their vote was not that awesome, they got a smashing majority in the election that just happened in Britain, a really, really big mandate to govern. And what they turned to do, as we see in the first British budget, was they decided government finances must be repaired. And so they addressed revenue issues, and they addressed, in effect, an austerity agenda in a way in the British budget. And the consequence has been that they've collapsed politically, and that they're actually trailing the Tories incredibly after they just got elected with a smashing majority. And I think the point here is that the public, which is thinking about housing prices and about the cost of groceries and the general affordability crisis, doesn't think that the top priority is for the government to fix its own finances. What they think is the government should be helping them. Ms. Freeland, in her work as finance minister in the last, let's say 3 to 6 months, appeared to me to be captured by her finance officials in a way. And what she seemed to be doing, and we see this in her letter, was saying it's time for the government to fix its finances, to step down from the COVID spending, and that's not the public mood. Where she was trying to steer the government to isn't where it can go if it wants to survive in a minority parliament and then in an election in Canada. And so she essentially, in a blind alley in her work with the finance department, and obviously we have a pretty lively character there who does not consider her political career to be over. And what she really did was pull the rip card, not just on this position the Prime Minister was trying to put her in, but also where she was going as a political figure, that she was becoming a very unpopular finance minister, out of step with where the public's at, apparently tone deaf, and she just magnificently bailed from that and hit a reset in her career and put herself in position to maybe be a player. But I got to say this. Usually political parties elect leaders who they think are loyal to their governments. And that's the problem with this whole game, is when you create such a serious crisis for your own team, and then you say to your team, therefore I should lead you, sometimes people don't buy that.
Well, it was the nature of the attack, right, Brian? I mean, to be honest, Paul Martin never said anything remotely close to that about the Chrétien government.
No.
Yeah,
I
mean, we think about the great finance minister rebellions that occurred, in Australia and in Britain and in Canada. It was always, I'll lead the team better. It wasn't the team's wrong. And that's, in a way, you could say that she overplayed her hand.
Yeah. There's an interesting scenario, just to go back to Ian's question about process, because this is deep in the weeds, but I think it actually has real world consequences, which is the Liberal Party apparatus has been asked what time frame they could run a leadership race in. And they came back and apparently said 6 months, which is kind of absurd on one level. I mean, says someone once told me, the problem is we now have a party run by data bureaucrats instead of organizers. But I mean, it's clearly possible. You look what Doug Ford did in Ontario in terms of winning a leadership in a short race. But obviously the slight difference is there's also the next time, in theory, if the government faces Parliament when it comes back, it could fall before all of that. So now Dalton McGuinty dealt with that by proroguing and then running a leadership race while the House was prorogued. There is actually, though, one potential solution, which is a bit like what Trudeau Sr. did in 79, 80, which was, that actually the executive asked the caucus for advice on the issue. The caucus elects an interim leader of the party who then, addresses the U.S. issue, and then in that position ends up going to the polls. And, it does that necessarily follow the Constitution? I bet you there's a party constitution. There's a way to make that work. So that is not an impossible scenario where you get effectively an appointed interim leader of the party who has the authority of prime minister and becomes the person who leads the party into the polls based on the kinds of issues we've been talking about here. And in that world, that list narrows pretty quickly to someone like Dominic LeBlanc.
Yeah, that would be a very good scenario. Very good scenario for him. I presume that's why Eddie is promoting the idea, because he may use Freeland as a fig leaf, but there's no chance that process would result in Freeland being chosen.
Zero. I mean, the party apparatus is Justin Trudeau's now.
Yeah. So, hey, Ian, let me start with you on this, but I want to hear from everybody. What is the responsibility of the chief of staff to the leader when the interests of the leader and the interests of the party diverge significantly?
Well, this is a very complicated situation, made easier by the fact that the chief of staff is the chief of staff to the prime minister and answers to the prime minister and not to anybody else. And so, your accountability, your responsibility, or sort of ethical obligation is to the boss. That said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're there to, I'm not in the Machiavelli secretary to the prince, where the secretary to the prince is the one really in charge and is there to manipulate the boss. There's no indication, I don't think, that Ms. Telford is anything other than extraordinarily loyal to Mr. Trudeau personally. And so I would hope in her shoes that I would, if it were me, want to make sure the prime minister got access to all of the feedback and all of the information, that all of the views, all of the pressure points, all of the emotional rants from other party members, that he needed to come up with a decision that was best for him. And insofar as he wanted to think about the future of the party, the future of the party. This morning's Globe and Mail story, if it is correct, and I don't know whether it is correct, I don't really know, I've only met Ms. Telford once, is that she's forwarding all the phone calls from people who want Mr. Trudeau to stay and blocking all the phone calls of people who want him to leave. Now, it strikes me, having been in that position, and Tim will have had the same experience, people read into the chief of staff's decisions about this sort of thing very self-serving motive. So who knows? But let's be clear, the chief of staff's there to work for the prime minister, not for the party, not for other factions inside the party. I know Mr. Harper for a very long time. He's a friend of mine in addition to a fellow I work for. And, I appreciate the times he trusted me to run interference on some of this stuff. But on the big decisions about his future, his cabinet, the direction of his government, he certainly wasn't going to depend on me alone for who he wanted to talk to, nor would I have expected him to. And if he had, to make sure he hears from a bunch of different perspectives. The stories we're getting about, Mr. Biden's team kind of coping with a president who was really only kind of on the job for a few hours a day, and the way that they wrapped a blanket around him did not serve Mr. Biden, did not serve the Democratic Party, did not serve, I don't think, the United States very well. That's the same situation inside Mr. Trudeau's office right now.
Well, it's been a year, hasn't it? You'd be forgiven for thinking it hasn't exactly overflowed with charity and kindness. Social media and our airwaves just seem to brim with all sorts of ugliness. Granted, a lot of it originated far away. But still, everything slops over onto everything else nowadays. No wonder we're reading reports about people clamping their eyes shut and simply refusing to take in news stories. Anyway, I can proudly say we've managed to keep the conversation pretty civil on this pod. In fact, I would humbly submit that we set a bar for listening to one another across party lines, across culture battlefields, and generally across the public square. I know that is a big reason that our sponsor, CN, continues to sponsor us. The railway is similarly inclined. Its railroaders, as I have said here many times, keep Canada's economy moving, day in, day out, year in, year out. And the company itself has in word and deed helped bind the disparate regions of this nation together for more than a century. Its first message after the U.S. elections last month was that Canadians and Americans cooperate in a million ways to their mutual benefit every day. And that's where CN's focus will remain in the turbulent months to come. In the spirit of the season, CN wants to wish health and happiness to all its stakeholders, its customers, and all of you, gentle listeners. Is it too corny to say be kind to someone? To stop and thank the person bagging your groceries or driving the bus? I don't think it's a stretch to say that's the Canadian way. While I'm at it, I'd also like to say this. As we gather with family in the next few weeks, CN railroaders will continue to run trains in that cold outside, baby, enabling all the comforts we take for granted. That's worth a thank you too. Brian, if you were in Ms. Telford's shoes, how would you be handling this situation?
You know, I've gone through different modes on this from, when I was younger, just absolutely insane worrier to, let's say, a more moderate view about what the chief of staff should be doing in situations like this. I came around to thinking last time I had a gig like this that really, in many ways, your key job, and here I'm basically joining what Ian just said, is you need to be a very smart, well-informed, and politic convener. And when your leader has a really big crisis and a big problem, that they have the facts that they need to make the decision that they can make. And so you're going to want to convene some polls if you can get them really fast. You want to convene the principal lieutenants whose loyalty you must have if you're going to continue. You need to understand where your caucus is coming from and need to know enough about the world out there that your leader can make a reasonable decision. That's part one. And then part two is somewhere along the line, if you have a good relationship with your boss. So with Roy Romanow, that would typically be over some absolutely shockingly inedible lemon chicken in his condo in Regina. And he'd look at you and go, "What do you think?" And then it's time to do the job. And then you basically got a fight or flight decision to make. So the fight is, I think you should stay, and here's how I think you could do it. You're only one voice in that circumstance, but the leader will want to know what you think. Or you say, I think you're done. I think you need to wrap up. In which case, if the leader decides to stay anyway, you're done. And what you need to do is hand over to somebody else who wants to fight. That's my take on it, And I think Katie Telford is a formidable person. She's not stupid. I'm sure that she's making sure that he hears what he needs to hear to make this decision. But she is a fighter.
Right. Tim, your take on this?
Yeah, I think you have a responsibility to ensure that the leader has transparent and complete access to what you hope and understand to be the accurate situation. And that means, you expose him or her to, good news, bad news, ultimately honest news. I think you have a responsibility to not steer that in a direction, because at the end of the day, Ian's point is right. Your responsibility is to the leader, and that's the person who hires you and pays you. I think you also have the responsibility and to provide your own honest advice. And David, you've been in rooms where we've had to do that. And I think in that context, what you say is, look, I'm here for your decision, and we will support you in that decision, or unless you like that discussion we had about the 50 Quebec staff who refused to canvass, you don't get to keep your jobs and do that. But I do think you have the responsibility to say, here's what I think you should do. You make the decision, I'll support your decision. And that can be in the current role or a different one. I'm not sure you necessarily have to leave if you say you should go and they decide to stay. But you have to be ruthlessly honest about what you think is the right decision. I think ruthless about ensuring they get accurate, complete information. That is, I think I like the convener word. I think it is part of the function to be a convener. And obviously part of that function of controlling that information flow is ensuring that that they don't get access to people don't get access to them who are going to be unhelpful in that process from the sense of being not objective. Although my experience with almost every leader is no matter what information flows you set up, they go around them anyway. But that's, at the end of the day, you're there in a role that has the primary responsibility to that person. And that's the job.
And if I could just add to what come back to what Tim and Brian said, in a sense, the senior staff there in PMO, it's a decision about, are they in or out as well? I assume there's some reflection going on of the people who were involved in setting up this infamous Zoom call of last Friday and decisions to go on vacations or to go contemplate the gray sky of winter online for the weekend while there was this crisis, building. So people reflecting, what mistakes did I make? What mistakes did we make? What did we miss? And so on and so forth. Because there's no more mistakes like that for the next, year if Mr. Trudeau decides he wants to stay, and you're in for what could be an extremely bloody internal war. The staff has to be up for that as well. The longevity of the chief of staff here is an issue of whether. It's hard to imagine, I guess, from insiders that how the government would function without Ms. Telford. But if Ms. Telford isn't in for a very difficult kind of 6 to 12 months to 24 months again, that itself might be a consideration for the Prime Minister, certainly a consideration for her.
Hey, I think you all said that at some point in the reflections that the Prime Minister is undertaking, that he would turn to you and ask for your advice. So I'll admit that I look at this purely through the spectrum of a Liberal partisan and somebody who thinks about campaigns. And I feel that I have all the information I know to say confidently that Mr. Trudeau should not lead the party into the next election from an electoral standpoint. Are there considerations that I'm not factoring in that are more related to government that argue differently?
Well, this gets into the bigger question that I think we've been butting up against here, which is that we've been talking about a series of considerations that are good from now until the 20th of June or 20th of January in a certain sense. But, there's the prospect of a brutally damaging, really brutally damaging trade war with the United States. This is not COVID type shutdowns. This is not the 2008 financial crisis. This is something quite a bit different and in a sense much more difficult up against a single protagonist in the United States. And it's not clear, hasn't been clear to me that the government has given 5 seconds worth of thought to this before the U.S. presidential election results were out and has been sort of scrambling since then. And there's I think therefore a sort of a default tendency to go back and play the last playbook that Brian spoke about earlier. He was involved in for the negotiation of CUSMA, but I don't think that's an adequate playbook for what's coming at the end of January. So I think that the countervailing view here, David, is let's say there's a shortened leadership race that only takes 3 months instead of 6 months, or 2 months instead of 6 months. That still takes us 5 or 6 weeks with that, your acting prime minister, acting liberal leader or interim liberal leader kind of scenario, 6 weeks into what could be an extraordinarily devastating, jobs heavy sort of devastation of starting with the auto industry and moving outwards from there, sort of demolishing of at least the central Canadian economy and possibly the Canadian economy more broadly. I think this is where the timing couldn't have been worse. I think the Prime Minister's got to have in his mind, if I stick it out until October and I'm able to do a deal with Mr. Singh in February or whatever, is it better to have a Prime Minister that Mr. Trump seems to enjoy humiliating on Twitter, but at least can have a single view of how this works? Is there a playbook for that that's commensurate with the challenge of what's coming on January 20th? In other words, not the last playbook of the CUSMA negotiation. Is it really in the national interest to have that kind of uncertainty inside? It sort of says here, this is where since I'm not a Liberal partisan, but I do look at this through governing and campaigning. In a sense, it's an indulgence of the Liberals, sorry guys, that all of this can be put on hold while the Liberal Party sorts out its own internal leadership problem. And I think by the 22nd of January, if we're looking at tens of thousands leading to hundreds of thousands of layoffs, starting in Windsor and rippling up through the auto industry, and then through the aerospace industry, and then across the goods manufacturing side of the economy and so forth, by the 10th of February, is the economic devastation so bad that there's not much left of the Canadian economy. And frankly, this is a decision for why I think Mr. Singh blundered badly this week. What does Mr. Singh do in the face of thousands of unionized workers being laid off because every bit of auto, doodad, screw, and sub-assembly plant, and what are all the different auto parts that move across the border 6 or 7 times while a car is being manufactured, takes a 10, 20, 25% tariff, God knows what. I mean, I think those are scenarios that you have to consider seriously. And in a sense, I get that there's an internal Liberal Party thing here, but the devastation, everything Brian said about the current public mood, I think is basically right, but we only have to look ahead 60 days to see what could be a quite different situation. And if you're worried about the future of the Liberal Party, the party that's in charge when there's that kind of devastation, and Mr. Trump is taking advantage of it every 8 hours on Twitter or whatever his thing, Truth Social, whatever his thing's called, that party will never govern again.
Yeah. If I can just build on that, it's the worst possible time to have a ministerial crisis. And look, the same thing just happened in Germany, where the chancellor and the finance minister couldn't agree on how to govern, and the finance minister wanted austerity, and the prime minister did not. And so the coalition has dissolved. The Bundestag has just voted no confidence in the government, moved by the prime minister, and they're going to have an election where there's probably going to be quite possibly a change of government. It was the last thing Germany needed, in the face of similar challenges from Mr. Trump, plus a war on their eastern border. It was the last thing they needed. What you needed was a really strong government that was going to react decisively and with strong leadership. And just to sort of savor this for a bit longer, and I completely agree with you. And the public right now is on affordability issues, but that's not what they're going to be thinking about 60 days from now if Trump does what he said he's going to do. And authoritarians have a pattern of doing what they say they're going to do. And he has done this before. We've seen this before, that trumped up saying that Canada is a national security risk to the United States. Okay, the people who 2 generations ago were fighting next to each other on D-Day, and now we're a national security risk to the United States. And on that basis, he's going to work to crash our economy so that we come crawling to him. Is going to require a very strong and coordinated response from the government of Canada, and for responsibility from its political actors. And we're not done with that, because after that's over, I believe there's going to be a change of government in Quebec. And I believe that the new government in Quebec is going to run another sovereignty referendum, and the issues basically going to be, how did you deal with this economic crisis that we're just talking about? So the unity of the country could be at play here in a couple of years. In any event, the government, whether or not we weather this Trump thing, there will be a change of government in Quebec, and there will be likely another referendum, because the current leader of the PQ is explicitly committing to do it, and I think he means it. And he is busy quoting, if you follow his feed like I do, he just repeats Pierre Poilievre's speeches. He says, "Don't take it from me. The leader of the Conservative Party thinks Canada's broken. So do I. That's why we need a yes vote in the referendum." Okay, so there's 2 big crashes coming. So that, we have to get our act together here. Germany has to get its act together, and Canada needs to get its act together. And that's the perhaps final challenge that you asked about, government challenges. That's the big government challenge, I think. And this man has been our prime minister. He needs to do something really, really smart now, or he needs to hand over to somebody else really fast. And then they need to do something really, really smart. And if they don't, then we're going to have a shambles of an election, possibly the shambles of a government in the middle of a terrible crisis. And we know what that looks like. That's what government was like in the 30s, where democracies in Europe simply couldn't handle the challenges in front of them and disintegrated.
It's the holiday season, Herle Burly-ites. Besides wintry snowshoes in the forest with Terry and Ryder, I also really like numbers at this time of year and all year long. That's why I've been polling for over 30 years. So let me share a few numbers that I learned from our sponsor, Fidelity Investments Canada. According to industry research, 64% of Canadians say they have investments. Of those who invest, 61% say they hold mutual funds. Mutual funds are by far the most common savings vehicles for middle-class Canadians. Now, if you are a mutual fund investor, you may have noticed that over the years, you get lots of mail. That's because by securities regulations, mailing paper is the default way to communicate with you. Let me tell you some more numbers I learned. It is estimated that 900 tons of paper are used by the industry every year, which is equivalent to 57 CN towers stacked on top of each other. And when told about this environmental harm, 83% of Canadians say they want to receive their financial statements electronically. Fidelity could not agree more with this overwhelming majority of Canadian investors, while being committed to providing paper for those who want it. Because Canadians deserve to be informed about how their investments are performing the way they want. And because performance matters. Tim, back clean up here. How do you see the political interests of the Liberal Party versus the national interests of the country? Are they different?
Yes, definitionally they are. But
well, no,
I think
in this particular case,
in this circumstance, I think. So, picking up on what
normally I would disagree with you. Normally I would say they're absolutely consonant, but in this instance they may be different.
Yeah. So, but to pick up what Brian and Ian said, so the question you asked was, is there a government-based reason for the Prime Minister to hang on that it rises above the interests of the Liberal Party, which you articulated? And I think there is one, if that's the path he chooses, but it has to involve a bit of a change of, frankly, of how he's dealt with the issue to this date. So I think it is. I'm not sure an election in the middle of dealing with the Trump threat and tariffs is a good idea. I'm not sure, uncertainty and chaos inside government is a good thing either, right? So the path of good governance at this point would say you need to have a whole of government, to use that horrible phrase, approach to the issue and crisis that's coming, that you pull together all of the levers of the premiers of the private sector, but around a unified approach that includes, all the kinds of tools that you have in what is a threatened trade war. And that is the sole thing the Prime Minister is focused on. No other issue is of interest to him, no matter what it is. It is all about this, and he personally leads that effort, and it's because that's the most important issue facing the country. It's not about the Liberal Party. It's not about, the uncertainty of an election, the uncertainty of chaos are both twin evils, one of which is the path of an election, one of which is the path of a potential leadership. And so the best outcomes for the country are based on it. But that means articulating that path to say, here is why I'm staying, here is what I'm doing. My efforts will be all about and only about this. And if that means the other parties take me down in the course of trying to deal with, they will do that. But this is what I'm focused on. I haven't seen that kind of articulation of a public policy purpose to this point from the Prime Minister. And is that a possible basis for a government answer? Yes. Is it plausible? Yeah, it's plausible.
Wait, think about
Lyndon Johnson used that rationale. Lyndon Johnson used that rationale to leave. Lyndon Johnson said, I can't spend a day campaigning while this war is going on. I've got to solve this war, right? And I can't spend any time campaigning.
Well, I was answering your hypothetical, David. So but that is that same logic leads you to the kind of notion of an interim leader. If you're going to leave as Trudeau instead of a full-blown leadership in the middle of this, impending crisis across the border.
Right. Well, let's move to that impending crisis across the border. So Minister LeBlanc did me a big favor of coming on this podcast this week and acknowledged to me that they do not know what Trump wants. I mean, he was in Mar-a-Lago, he was at dinner. They don't know what Trump wants. They don't know whether Trump wants us to fix our border and spend more money on defense, and he's threatening us with tariffs in order that we do that, or whether he just wants to kick us around a little bit for fun, or whether he believes in tariffs and is going to impose tariffs no matter what we do on the border because he thinks they're good economic policy for the United States. If you don't know what will satisfy him, it's pretty difficult to develop a strategy, Brian, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the last thing you said there is the truth of the matter, which is that Team Trump, not just Trump, but the people he's put into the key economic jobs in Washington, believe in tariffs. They like tariffs, and where they're coming from is tariffs will allow America to undo the damage that offshoring has done to itself, that this is the way that they're going to unwind, the export of the American manufacturing industry to China fundamentally, and then what they view as unequal trade relationships with most of their trade partners. And they want to right the ship. And they also want to go back to what they used to be for most of their history, which is a mercantile republic whose relationships with others are purely basis on their own self-interest that are entirely unsentimental. And that's where they're coming from. They don't want to lead the free world anymore. They want to go back to America the way it was before. And by the way, I'm not sure that it's just the auto industry that's at risk here. Well, it remains to be seen whether a 25% tariff would cover Canadian energy exports in a circumstance where the same administration is talking about increasing its oil production from 9 to 12 million barrels a day and may not feel that it needs Canadian. It may not feel it needs Canadian oil as much, and B, it may want to put those exports under pressure to justify the increase in domestic production. So we may have a equal opportunity economic crisis here that affects both Western and Eastern Canada. We'll see. But in any event, I think what he wants to do is develop a flimsy pretext that wouldn't hold up to a hearing under any of our trade agreements, a national security pretext that is without foundation, to force us into a crisis in which we are going to have a bilateral negotiation where they can dictate terms because they're dealing with us one-on-one, where they're 10 times as strong as we are, having put us into a crisis, and that he wants to do what he wasn't able to do with CUSMA, which is to dictate terms to us. And fundamentally, he's already set the bar. He views $100 billion trade surplus as we have as a subsidy, and he wants it to be zero because from his perspective, they're giving us that money as a subsidy. That's where he's coming from. Now, that's all nonsense. And by the way, his tariff strategy may also be nonsense because one of the things that happens when you bring in a tariff like that is there's a currency adjustment and the Canadian dollar tanks and washes out the tariff. So then if he wants to pursue this strategy, then he has to double up again. At a certain point, the legal basis of doing this becomes flimsy. But I think that's the way he seems to operate. And it all boils down to trying to put himself into a power position with us to dictate terms. That's why I said earlier, I think we need some friends here. It would be nice if what the government of Canada is already doing, the visit to Mar-a-Lago, the very high touch outreach to the Trump team that the government of Canada is already doing, hopefully that will work. And hopefully the measures that I'm sure Mr. LeBlanc talked about that are trying to take his flimsy pretexts seriously and say, yes, there's a fentanyl crisis on the Canadian border, which there is not. And yes, there's a migrant crisis on the border, which there is not. And we're going to deal with this by spending $1 billion. In truth, if there's going to be a migrant crisis, it's going to be the other way. It's going to be what happens when Trump tries to deport 11 million people, and where do they run? But in any event, hopefully that will work. And if it doesn't work, then we're in a trade war. And trade war will be ruinous, but you have to fight. And then what we can't do is be in the position he wants to put us in, which is that it's just us against him, America against Canada, their hands around our throats, and they think they're going to dictate terms, which means we have, they're being true to their history and wanting relationships like that. And we should be true to our history, which is that we reach out for friends. We try to act multilaterally.
Tim, how would you be how would you be focusing? Would you be focusing on trying to forestall these tariffs or focusing on figuring out a way how to react to them?
Well, you have to do both, right? It's not an either or. I mean, you've got to try and deal with.
Sorry, I don't want my question to sound as stupid as it may have sounded, but there are resource allocations that go along with each of those tracks, right?
No, agreed. But I think. But to your point, if I'm going to be like launching, countervailing duties and tariffs on the U.S., I think in order to be able to have the credibility and legitimacy to do that, I need to have exhausted the other measures, which include things like, investments in the border security, like to deal with the pretext that he put up. And to say we've done those things. And it was interesting to me, you saw, the nominee for the border czar role, the Tom Holman, saw him interviewed, and he was saying we had a great first discussion, clear, interest in action. We'll have to see the actions, but, if we can do what we talked about, then that's, a significant effort towards us doing, making our border safe, right? So, And you need then to make that true. And then now the challenge you've got is the point that Dominic was articulating, which is if you look at the narratives that Trump's put out there, he's said those border and fentanyl thing, but his language around Canada has migrated to the $100 billion surplus language, which, and so that's not fixable, right? Because it's not a real thing. But I think you do have to invest in the other steps to say, hey, we've got, the number of crossings have gone from, 6 down to 1, and we can't find fentanyl except coming north. And do the things that we got a couple of drones, RCMP, cooperation of border agencies, all of that. And then he puts the tariffs on. And then I agree, we got to find some friends. I mean, that's, we've run away a bit from Mexico on this for, what are obvious reasons, but it is a potential friend on this. But there are others.
We haven't run away from them. Doug Ford's been beating them over the head with a baseball bat.
Yeah. Well, not the only one. Yeah. Not the only one, right? Yeah. And even some of the initial language out of the federal government kind of implied, we're all on our own here, although it moved back from that. But all that being said, I agree. I think if we're in a world where we're taking them on alone, we got a real problem.
Ian, you got any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I don't want to be too depressing before Christmas here. I'm not sure whether the horse is already bolted.
I'm wearing a lovely Christmas sweater today.
You're doing your best.
There you go.
You're doing your best. You are cheering me up. One sweatshirt at a time. I'm not sure if the horse hasn't already bolted the barn here. Mr. Ford is trying to get his own one-on-one meeting with President Trump. We saw that Premier Legault was, posting photos of his chumming around over in France with the incoming president. Premier Smith, Premier out here, promising she'll see President Trump at the inauguration. I understand why each premier is pursuing his or her own political objectives here, but what this is not Brian's very strategic, potentially tough, reserving, countervails and other opportunities into the future strategy, nor is it what I think also has to be part of this here. If by the end of February we really are into this very strong tariff approach, there will be economic costs in the United States. They won't be the same as the economic costs here because the United States is not as trade exposed an economy as we are. It certainly isn't as trade exposed to Canada as we are. We always say that New York is, their biggest export market is Canada by far. But in fact, although that's true, it's this percentage of the New York economy. Let's be clear about how important that is to the New York overall. And you could do the same thing across all the other states. But there will be a cost there, in particular if I think Brian might be right here that the tariffs extend to oil and gas exports from Canada into the United States. There will be a transitional cost to that at the pump. It will not be entirely erased by a currency rebalancing. The scenario I fear there is that Trump does an immigration deal with Venezuela in exchange for more heavy oil moving from the Venezuelan production into the U.S. refinery market. That is a direct national threat to Canada's direct national interest. That's a 1-for-1 substitution of very valuable exports from Canada. We cannot survive that. We cannot stand by for that sort of thing. That is devastating to the economy, more so than the auto industry. But I think playing ahead here a little bit to come the end of February, what the costs are in the United States economy, and making it clear that's a reflection back on the trade policy as part of getting ready for what could be. LeBlanc's right. We perhaps don't quite know what the negotiating point is here, but I think the worst case scenario is the one somebody has to plan for that. And part of that is a very long, very deep tariff war that is expensive for American consumers at a time when cost of living issues are as important there as they are here. And beginning to marshal the forces for that now is part and parcel of the strategy.
Here's where, you would have a really, really important election debate. Because some of the premiers that Ian was just talking about are pretty clear on what they want to do, which is give him whatever he wants, right? That's essentially what they're saying. Oh, that's not what Premier Ford is saying. And Premier Ford is playing a good game, I think.
Smith is saying
and
that.
So maybe that's what the next election is about, which is somebody's going to say, give him whatever he wants. That the way to solve this is we're going to be his best little buddy and whatever he wants, which sounds like it's migrated from the phony national security issues to somehow we want you to make the $100 billion trade, quote unquote, trade surplus go away. Give him whatever he wants. And somebody else is going to say, we have to fight. We're in a trade battle and we have to fight and we can't win it alone. And that if those are the stakes, then we're going to have a real Canadian election about real issues for once, where we're going to make a real decision that will be really important. Maybe I could inflict a quick Saskatchewan story on you.
Always welcome on this pod.
In the 90s, the Americans went after durum wheat in Canada, and with an undefendable tariff, and so we tried to do something about it in the government of Saskatchewan. And one of the things we tried to do was go visit the border Congress players who were helping to make this happen. So we ended up in the office of Max Baucus, the senator from North Dakota, try to persuade him away from this economy wrecking measure, which was in a small way this kind of stuff. So we show up there, Premier Romanow and I, and a couple of intergovernmental officials. They make us sit in this little waiting room while groups of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and local mayors and the local Chamber of Commerce go one by one past us to go meet with the senator, who spends a lot of time with them, getting his photos taken with them. And finally, just before he leaves for the day, literally 15 minutes before his car is about to leave, he ushers into the office. And then he filibusters the meeting for 10 of those 15 minutes talking about rodeos. And then he finally gets around to, so, Mr. Premier, what can I do for you? So Premier Romanow outlines the devastating effect of the American tariffs on the grain business in Canada. He listens patiently for about 3 minutes. And then he puts up his hand. He goes, "It was awfully nice of you to come visit me, Premier. I'm very interested in what you had to say. But here's the thing. I don't have any voters in Saskatchewan. Goodbye."
Goodbye.
And that was it. And then he left. So, what I've always gotten out of that is, in a dispute with the Americans, you need to make it hurt for Americans. And then they've got voters who tell them that this is bad and it needs to change. And that's the part of the matter here. And that's why they think they've got us over a barrel and they could just go like this. And we have to show that that's not true if we choose to fight and not be his best little buddy. And and that is a strategic challenge where you need to map out where are Trump's supporters in Congress, where are the most important people he's going to listen to, and find a way to make it hurt for them. And that's much easier done with friends than by yourself. But that's how you fight. And we have to decide whether that's when we want to fight.
I don't know whether you remember,
I don't think we want to
Dave.
be Trump's best little buddy, okay? But that's a fateful and big decision, especially if they go after the oil business.
Tim?
I was going to say, I don't know if you remember, David, but we had the mad cow disease outbreak when we were just entering into power, and so the Americans shut the border to our beef exports, which hurt out west. And then we did everything we could to, clean up the problems, deal with it. We got the sign off.
I think it was called Shoot, Shovel, and Shut Up, wasn't it?
Yeah. and we went.
That was Ralph.
Yes. And we went to the US President Bush and said, okay, we've got all the sign off. It's cleaned up. It's all good. Your health authorities have signed off. So can you please open the border? And he said, well, here's the problem. There was an election going on in one of those cattle states out west. And he said, yeah, I'm not going to do that until that election's over. Okay. So the fundamental point is they're going to make their decisions in their own interest. And even presidents that didn't have the America First attitude that Trump has made decisions on that basis. So if we're going to move them, we have to find ways to make the decision makers in America say the best outcome is not this tariff thing, but is something else. And that's going to be complicated, is literally Congress seat by Congress seat, senator by senator, Republicans only and mostly. And that's in part what we can do from out of our economic exports and activities, but also if we have friends who can do the same with the same interest, that'd be helpful too.
Well, earlier on, Brian was waxing nostalgic about the Team Canada effort in CUSMA back in 2019 or whenever that was. And the circumstances were so different. You had a first-term federal government that still had a very strong mandate with the Canadian people. You had a bunch of friendly faces around the FedProv table that were interested in working collaboratively with the federal government. That's all different now. You've got a federal government with very little political legitimacy that looks like it's on its way out the door. And you've got a bunch of antagonistic faces around the FedProv table. Is it possible to pull together that kind of Team Canada effort under federal leadership in this circumstance?
Today, absolutely not. 60 days from now, maybe. So it just depends how scared people are. At a certain point, the public looks at their premiers and at their political leaders of all stripes in Parliament and goes, you want to bicker now? But maybe not. I think maybe what has to happen here is that the government of Canada, under whoever is the prime minister, puts together a proposal, and then maybe the other parties need to put together proposals, and then maybe the public then needs to decide which one they want to go with. In which case, maybe the best thing for Canada is a election really soon on this issue, where we're discussing something important, and then at least we'll have some clarity on this matter. And then maybe putting together Team Canada will be better. But I think events will drive the possibility, or maybe not, in which case, as I said, we end up as a shambles. And, there's plenty of precedent for democracies becoming shambles when they're facing overwhelming problems. And,
you may get your wish. I'm informed by my team that Singh has just put out a letter saying he's going to bring down the government no matter who leads it.
I did hear something about that.
Yeah, but that was for him to have said he would bring down the government if Trudeau was leader was dumb. So he's just fixing his own dumb comment.
Yeah, I think that's a significant move by Mr. Singh. And so what it means is what I was saying in a way, right? Which is that the government's going to need to address this issue, and it's going to need to think about timing. Tim used the pirogue word. I guess they've got a decision to make about whether they want to buy themselves some time or whether they want to face the House, where all three parties in the opposition are now saying it's time for an election.
Okay. So the last thing I want to ask you guys is a bit of a leadership question, but not a political party leadership question, which is, I don't have the impression that Canadians are seized with this threat in the way that we have been discussing it for the last 15 or 20 minutes. And it could require a lot of sacrifice and social solidarity to get through this kind of a thing. What should the federal government be communicating now to Canadians about what we are up against?
Well, I would agree with your assessment, in part because Yeah, I'm sure all of us are running into people who, in our various social circles or business circles, who actually don't believe he'll ever do it, right? Who don't think it's real. They just think it's, so uneconomic a move that it can't possibly make sense. I don't agree with that assessment. I think he's shown the ability to impose tariffs when he said he was going to before. And so then, do you fearmonger? But I think part of it is you have to actually decide that this is the most important and serious thing this government is facing. You communicate that in the way you're organized, what you do, how you behave. You don't fearmonger and create panic, but you say this is an impending issue of huge import for our economy, and we are focused on doing everything we can to prevent it and everything we can to ensure that we can mitigate every impact of this. And if it is imposed, to make it as short as possible. And that is what we're focused on. That is the plan we're coming up with. And it may very well be that, you have at the end that that's the plan we'll take to the people. But I don't think you put that on the table. But I think you have to articulate through your focus and what you're talking about that does carry the weight that we are putting on it.
Didn't prime ministers used to give big speeches about things like this?
Well, I was going to say, imagine to go back to Tim's earlier comments or some of the earlier taps we had. Let's go back to the beginning of our conversation here. Imagine if on Monday evening, instead of going off to see the Laurier Club and give whatever speech that was that the Prime Minister gave to the Laurier Club, which seemed to me to be a farewell speech rather than anything else, if instead of that, and instead of running around to a caucus meeting where he was only there for long enough for everybody to, be upset that he didn't give them enough time and so forth. Imagine if instead of that, we'd had an address from the Prime Minister at 8:00 to the House of Commons or, on national television, which he said, keeping in mind Freeland's letter. We've talked about, I agree with Brian, Freeland's sort of disavowal of the government's fall fiscal stance vis-a-vis cost of living and so forth was a bit hard to take. But the rest of her letter, I thought, was right on, is that there's a threat here coming. We have to keep our powder dry for that. You have to deal in a mature way with the premiers, which I thought was a very devastating line. We have to be serious about this. I think that has laid track for her into the future if she's going to run a leadership campaign here to say, see, I told you so. We got to be careful about this. So imagine if the Prime Minister had said on Monday evening in a big address to the nation, we have this threat. We don't know what's going to happen, but we have to prepare for the worst here. I'm calling on, the government is now going to be laser focused on the threat from the south. Sorry, in brackets, sorry, everybody running your leadership campaign, but we can't have a leadership campaign now because we've got to stick through this. Something about, Brian's line about we want to be Trump's little friend. No, we're not going to do that. We have to be ready for what could be a very painful process here, but the nation's existence. He doesn't believe there's a Canadian nation. The post-national country of Canada has some value above and beyond post-national, a hotel where people just stay for a little while before they go someplace else, or whatever his view of the country is. I don't know what his view of the country is. But that Canada is something valuable. We have to stick through this because otherwise, we're either going to hang together or we're going to hang separately. And I'm the guy to do that because I'm very tough. And remember when I beat that guy in the boxing match and so forth, that's the approach I'm bringing to this. And that's very much what we didn't have. And the more that vacuum of leadership goes on, the more we have not the Team Canada, but the individual Captain Canadas of all the premiers and so on and so forth trying to go and sue for terms on whatever they think they can get. And the longer that goes on, the worse it gets.
Brian, can you wrap up for us?
Well, I agree with all of that. I just quibble over timing. The meteor hasn't hit yet. And until the meteor hits, I don't think the public is going to keep thinking about what they have in front of their face right now, which is the shocking cost of groceries and the cost of their homes. That is what has been driving politics in Canada since the emergence from COVID, which is the consequence of inflation for people's daily lives. That's what's the crisis all around the democratic world. This, I think, will preempt it. So it's also gentlemen, it's December 20th. I don't think the Prime Minister can command public's attention on a meteor that hasn't hit yet. So I think the Prime Minister, if he was, for, let's say, whoever the Prime Minister is, what the government needs to do is articulate clearly in advance of the Trump's inauguration what they're doing. And look, I think they should take the excellent advice for getting on this pod. Start by seeing if you can avoid the problem and overall. Like the moves that they're making are the right ones. Maybe Team Trump can be talked out of this. That would be the best result. If Trump is inaugurated and he says what he's going to do, which is on a national security pretext, he's going to impose across the board 25% tariff on all Canadian imports, then that calls for a big statement that has been carefully thought through, that hopefully has support from all the premiers, that in a world which is not the one we live in now, that has Parliament's backing, and that talks to the people of Canada and says, we have got a big, big problem, and here's what I'm proposing to do about it. And by the way, I was just thinking, then he has two roads, or she, whoever the Prime Minister is, has two roads. One of them is to say, so I'm implementing it, I'm proroguing the House, we will implement this, and we will meet the House again with the throne speech and a budget, and how we're going to do this. That's door number one. Door number two is to do what Schultz just did in Germany and call an election and say, okay, now we're going to call an election with this before us, and we're going to decide how to deal with it. I've told you how I'm going to handle it. The opposition leaders will tell you how they're going to handle it. You choose. And then we have to unite as a country on what we're going to do. So those, government and politics come together maybe.
As much as I hate that idea, that will have to be the last word on this podcast because we're out of time. Thank you three so much. Ian, Brian, Tim, thank you so much for on such a busy professional and personal time to give us your wisdom on this stuff this week. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsors, CN and Fidelity Investments Canada. And Merry Christmas to all of you and to all of my listeners. Enjoy your holiday time. May it be full of rum and Hawkins cheesies. Buckle up for the new year, and we'll be back in January. See you then. In the meantime, take care of yourself.